Chapter 23. The sedimentary layers that can be found in the expansive region of Eldon, when compared to similar deposits in Hebra, the Gerudo Highlands, and Lanairu Mountains, provide essential ancient testimony not only to how old the continent currently known as Hyrule may be, but which of its species were among the first to populate its lands, and indeed, how intelligent life emerged upon its valleys, plateaus, cliffs and plains. Ongoing geological research has also pointed to infinitesimal inconsistencies between such sediments within similar areas, suggesting that even within each major quadrant of Hyrule, multiple epochs have contributed to unique features of these lands, suggesting a vibrant history of ecological diversity and cataclysmically shifting events. The contradictions in the land evoke a complicated history of its multiple foundings and empires, one that cannot be drawn neatly within a linear timeline, but must be considered within a more dimensional branch of study. Zelda read over the paragraph a dozen times, and still could not grasp a word. Her mind splintered in 100 distracted directions, none of which held the patience to process advanced carbon dating. Sands of Time, Tectonic Tales of Hyrulean Epochs, was the last tome left from her meager pile of books that remained in her bedroom. A forgotten mini-collection hadn't been transported to the library or destroyed in the castle's decades of dereliction. Although the chamber had been restored along with the rest of the castle after the upheaval, it was more of a suggestion of presence than conducive to one. Her desk was no longer a web of sketches and sprawls tacked up the walls, paintbrushes tossed haphazardly into beakers resting on tea-stained maps, but an empty slate with a single candlestick to infer that someone could, theoretically, reside here. Her bed was made but with the decline-era utilitarian linen, sheets and blankets that had faded from memory in lieu of the homely coziness of the hat-no-down feather bedding, and the firm, supportive, gigantic mattress soothed by the ultrafine cotton sheets in the royal chamber. This, more than anywhere else she'd been since her rescue, that was canon now, wasn't it? Felt like a prison cell, even more than the actual bars and chains that had confined her to the lockup for that one warning of a night alone. That hell reeked of ghosts and suffering, but not of this distinct, personal varietal. The girl she'd been in this very space, the one trying to write her own happiness on that now sanitized desk, dreading the exchange she was bound to have with her father that day. His belittling dismissal of her work, spitting in the face of the goddesses, their existence the only knowledge she needed to accept. The ego of believing anything better could be inferred from their creation. She courted impotence with her greed, her insistence to know instead of accept. No wonder they forsake her, withhold her light, bathe her instead with the blood of the people she could not summon the power to save. The hearth was empty, but free of its ash, and none of the servants had dared enter to light it for her. Several times a day a single knock would sound on the door, always at a different time, as to prevent her from anticipating it too accurately, to catch them in the act of setting a tray of breakfast, tea, or supper at the entrance. She accepted these offerings, though she was careful not to devour them as ravenously as she would have wished. Morning would have taxed her appetite, and she was certain the king would not be overlooking the details. Curiously, amongst the oven-warm nut cakes, steaming seafood stews and heaping bowls of Goron-scented curry rice, folded newspapers had begun appearing every few days. A peace offering, perhaps. There was the special edition from the torching of the menace, entreating the masses to believe she hadn't tipped herself over the highest balcony. The subsequent issues shifted their focus on the frothier, more mundane triumphs around the kingdom. Cece's waiting list for custom couture fittings had become so unruly that her sister Sophie was implementing a lottery. The Gorons had recently uncovered a new deposit of ore so rich it had to be kept under 24/7 armed guard at an undisclosed location. A new looming mill had been constructed just outside of Rito village, and a number of new apprentices, both Hylian and Rito, were venturing forth into the once remote fortress to resuscitate an art that had gone nearly extinct after the calamity. Lady Reiju had recently approved plans to move forward on converting the Lightning Temple into a university, where women throughout the kingdom could apply to study myth, history, and the thin veil between them. Everyone was moving on to a better life. All she'd wanted to give them, and yet somehow couldn't. Over 2 weeks had passed. 2 weeks she spent trying to shape from vapor where Link might be and what, exactly, she needed to do to bring him closer. Was he gathering forces in secret, unearthing factions still loyal to the princess and hero? Did he have any allies out in the world? Certainly the Sheikah, so used to scuttling in the shadows and underground, would be willing to aid him. Pura, Robbie, Impa and Joshua went on their remote odysseys constantly, and it could be up to a year before they heard from them in between. If Paye had survived the invasion, she would fight the Demon King to her dying breath. There were the unique systems of caves and wells, a labyrinth beneath Kakariko village, shrouded in secrecy and resonant with the echoing sacrifices of resistance. Surely enough places where he could be concealed, to reappear. Her logic trailed off here, a maddening variable she could not solve. Yes, her orders had been frenzied and obtuse, but in all the most dire scenarios she'd written in her head from the beginning of this
New Hyrule.
She never imagined this long of an absence, this permanent of an alternative life. 100 years in stasis, bound by seal to the calamity, 10,000 years dreaming in the sky. Only the most feral tendencies of her were pulsing in the deep recesses of her dragon's mind, and this half-year was the longest eternity she'd yet to know. And what of Ganondorf now, content in the evidence that he'd bested the goddess's curse, for this lifetime at least? The breadth he'd given her to grieve was admittedly astounding, but she knew his grace, even in victory's wake, was finite. His patience would run out, and it was best that she not be caught still pining when it was exhausted. She brought herself before the vanity mirror, and dusted off the glass with the one kimono sleeve she had left. As she suspected, she looked genuinely frightful. Her cheeks had sunken away, and the muscles that she'd honed in the everyday of the farm, which were already fading from life in the dollhouse, had positively atrophied. The gold in her hair had molded a mousy brown, hanging like grease stalactites around her face. A believable wreck. She took a deep, cleansing breath, summoning Ganondorf's Zelda back into her form. Slowly she shuffled to the bedroom door, turning the knob that had been unlocked, but undisturbed. Squinting down the hallway, she spotted a Rito youngling, her bright pink feathers giving her no leverage to hide in the sullen gray of the castle.
You!
Zelda called, her cracking voice echoing, making the poor creature flap instinctually in terror.
Yes?
A meek, forced reply lobbed back.
Please send for Lena, if you would be so kind,
she said.
Tell her I'll need assistance to get ready for dinner.
Ganondorf didn't glance up from his plate when the Verena opened the dining room doors. Not until Lena took 3 additional paces toward the table where the king hunched over his plate, chewing slowly. The table was leaden with food, an entire roast boar spread on a platter with a golden apple set into its jaw, resting on a bed of juicy ice fruit. Roasted pumpkins brimmed with steaming, thick broth heavy with meat and vegetable chunks. Wild berry tart and butter caramel cheesecake waited on tiered trays. Sky islands of sweetness left untouched by the solitary diner, his back to the fireplace, rearranging the sautéed peppers around with his fork.
Your Supreme Highness,
she said, clearing her throat.
The Queen has requested to see you.
The warmth in the guard's voice, the quickness with which the king was at his feet, closing the space between them within a breath. Lena had surprised him, she realized. Kept quiet as Zelda scrubbed the staleness of stasis off her skin and out of her hair, and admired the newly acquired kimonos that hung in the royal chamber's armoire, settling on a red version the color of poppies, embroidered with gold dahlias and leaves that twisted down her back and around her sleeves. Didn't send word while her hair was dry and plaited. The sweeps of kohl and smudges of topaz shimmer set on her eyelids, the color painted back on her lips. The whimsy of the gesture, the kindness within it. These warriors truly adored him, would do anything to spark him back to the king they adored, even if that meant doting on their sworn nemesis as if she, too, were a daughter of the sands. Her hands were in his, the prickling beard reddening her fresh skin as his lips pressed against them. His eyes closed at the touch, as if in meditation or prayer. An apology? or an indulgence, savoring the taste of his prize's return after the greatest threat to its allegiance had passed. Emerging of her own volition, he must certainly be pleased. She felt the flare of blood rushing to the tips of her ears, blushing at this overwhelming welcome.
"I'm sorry to have kept you waiting,"
she managed to say.
"Your patience with me is undeserved, but so appreciated." "Enough,"
he said, not unkindly.
"Sit, and bring some beauty to this somber prison of a dining room."
He pulled back the right side chair from the table, and she took the seat, the most tentative twitch of a smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. She had always hated this space, even after the restoration righted the shredded rugs and removed the shredded tables. It was still dim and stifling with its scant windows and oppressive iron chandeliers, like a pub you never glimpsed in the day.
"I think it could be improved, if some of these windows were expanded from floor to ceiling to let in the light,"
she said.
"Or perhaps some glass doors leading out to the terrace. There must be some sort of alternative for these candle fixtures as well, something more contemporary. They've always been unsightly,"
she said as a servant loaded her plate with shredded pork, warm spice-scented rice, and roasted sweet squash, the rich smell making her swoon with hunger. He eyed her as he took a swig of wine, clearing his throat.
"You don't care for this room?" "No, I've never liked it at all,"
she said between shovelfuls of dinner into her mouth.
"This was my father's castle, after all. We didn't agree on approaches to a great many things, design aesthetics being the least consequential, though it has endured past some other quarrels, it seems,"
she admitted, squinting in the dark.
"I'll send word to Hudson,"
Ganondorf said.
"I'm certain he can be brought back with his crew within the next few days. In the meantime, whatever sketches you can do will help expedite the process. He isn't the most creative, after all." "Wait, you mean, redo it now?"
she asked.
"Unless you'd like to spend the entire Hyrulean winter not able to see your food." "No, that would be a marked improvement, I'm sure,"
she said, drifting off to the stone archways that could be knocked out, letting the day in. What a sunrise they would get from this vista! And how lovely cut glass would be in place of those ancient chandeliers. Something Zoran, perhaps? They were so clever with shapes and fractals, if their artisans would consent to work with the monarchy, in the midst of all that had happened. But they didn't have a choice so much, did they? All of them, tiptoeing their best path around the lull beast.
"It's best to bring in as much light and warmth as we can. You've never known a winter in Hyrule, have you?" "Not one that I haven't already forgotten,"
he said.
"But, yes, the desert cycles through its seasons in a day, not a year. The season is mild, here on the plains," she said. "Your soldiers, however, may not find it hospitable when they're patrolling outside, especially after growing up in such sun-drenched conditions. What would you suggest?" "I just read in the paper,"
she mentioned, nodding her thanks to her invisible benefactor,
"that the Rito have opened up some new looms and mills. They make the finest coats in the kingdom, and could certainly outfit all the Verena, I'm sure." "And the Yiga?"
he asked ruefully.
"Those skin-tight suits are quite adept at trapping body heat,"
she said.
"I'm sure they'll fare just fine without them." "Such a diplomatic way of telling me to let the bastards freeze."
Ganondorf chuckled, watching the last swallow of wine whirlpool in his glass as the attendant placed a helping of cheesecake within his grasp, while Zelda accepted the tart slice where her emptied plate had been. They finished dessert in measured silence, until the king stood, offering her a nod.
"I'd be on taking breakfast in the North Tower,"
he said, standing from the table.
"There hasn't been a new maid selected, but we can arrange for the servants to wake you, if you'd be so inclined for the morning." "Oh, well, I was just actually thinking,"
she convincingly stammered.
"It seems inconvenient to have the staff traipse all the way out to the West Wing, when most of my things are already here. So it would seem logical, make the most sense even, if I accompanied you to the royal chamber, if that's all right, of course."
Even the Demon King himself couldn't contain his self-satisfied grin as his paw came to rest at the small of her back. and she felt the stiff squaring of her shoulders unhinge at its possessive reassurance. She'd entrenched herself beneath the dragon's wing once more, and the warmth was just as exquisite as she remembered. What she wouldn't do for Hyrule. Link pecked at the dirt with the tip of his boot, turning the tough soil to reveal the frost crystals spider-webbing beneath it. Soon the moat below would be sheets of ice, a perpetual dare to the kids in town to see who was brave enough to skate out to the docks. Aside from some sincere safety warnings shouted down from Hawes in the guard tower, that water isn't frozen solid. Go find a pond before your death wish comes true. You damn morons! There had been no consequence for approaching the castle. But what now? In His Supreme Highness's first winter? Would his comrades start hurling spears and cracking the sheets for sport? In these few weeks he'd already seen them chuck villagers that had annoyed or crossed or inconvenienced them into the lockup, too deep in serpentine within its keep to find again, even if they'd decided to prolong their pitiful suffering by delivering food and water. Since his promotion to inside the castle from Fort Hateno, he'd had precious little time within its walls. After Zelda and Ganondorf had vacated the library, the captain of the Yiga Castle Patrol had met them briefly, mostly to gloat over the commander's demise.
Blade Master my ass,
he spat,
thinking he could take my job right out from under me. I don't care what sorry useless piece of shit carcass you're carting up here, you're not taking my appointment. I won this command fair and square.
He took in a quick breath, then gestured out to the courtyard.
I don't see any use with throwing you two back out into that reeking marsh, though. So here's the deal. Yiga remain on the perimeter, so I'll have you outside here, making sure the library entrances are secure. I'll move Cleet from the observatory wall down here, so you can do your shifts at the outside perimeter?
Link dared to clarify. The captain didn't seem to think twice about the question, only seized on it to launch into another diatribe.
Nope, there's not so many positions inside that we're putting up. What with those elite Varenas taking all the sweet chamber doors and sanctum walks and all that good shit. And why? Because they're fun to look at. Makes this whole place seem like a damn harem.
He whisked his masked face around, making triple sure that they weren't still lingering.
If it were up to His Supreme Highness, I know we'd have all the top posts. He totally gets how much we've earned it. But his little Queen Zelda still doesn't care for us. Sure, forgive the guy who murdered your allies, spent lifetimes trying to destroy your kingdom, stole you from your farm, and organized the execution of your true love, but we have a few drops of bad blood between us, and she can't be in the same massive structure as us. Ungrateful, inconsistent bitch. So then, why doesn't she use her light stuff to, take us out?
He pushed, donning the effect he'd had to endure for months outside Kakariko, waiting for that tail chaser to show up again. After all these months, what was keeping her from using her power to escape? She had more than enough strength to get out from the castle's confines, even if the magic had been spent that first night.
You know that necklace she wears?
Link nodded. The unfamiliar, gigantic adornment swallowed her neck whole.
My cousin is friends with the Gerudo Town jeweler who made it. She comes up to Death Mountain sometimes, trying to scam her way into cheap rubies. Never let her talk you into a trade. Anyway, it's a fucking racket. But she knows her shit. And that middle red stone, the one that glows even though it's pitch black, it's crystallized gloom. Straight up, pure gloom that opens a chasm right above her heart and swallows up all the light. That's bullshit,
said the Yiga kid next to Link, whose name he wouldn't bother to learn for another few more weeks. Herman, it turned out to be.
Sure, it sounds like it. But I was here during the coronation, standing right there, in the sanctum, close enough to get King Sidon's guts on my shoes.
Link felt himself wince at the reference, a reaction he'd trained himself to contain behind the respite of his mask, keeping his body slack and unaffected as blisters and calluses formed along his lip and cheek, the tender places where he bit down all of his rage.
The king fastened that around her throat, and something was different. Not just with her, but in the whole hall. Like, I dunno, the sun going behind a cloud or some shit. And no one's seen a glimmer of her power since that day. Not a single spark.
An enchantment. One that was certainly breakable, but not by sheer will or force. If Zelda had any clue to its riddle, she'd have solved it on her own. Instead she was trapped, under a spell? He'd had so little to go on, but the panic in her face when she burst into the library was the same expression burned into his mind's eye from a decade ago. Her helpless cry as her body plummeted into the castle's crumbling abyss just shy of his grasp. Her only salvation, the secret stone, stealing her back 10,000 years. Genuine, world-shattering horror. If her mind wasn't her own, there would be no reason to care that she'd lost him. That woman just inside the wall was still his Zelda, her force dimmed, but her heart true. Just a breath away. A sliver of a miss from each other yet again. Since that night, Link had stalked the outside of the library, resting only to drown down another banana-scented meat skewer or take a nap, then went back to his slow circles beneath the darkened windows.
Marina.
Cleet, the third member of their outer library perimeter patrol, waved to the girl approaching with her dancing green eyes, the black kimono robe that swished just below her hips, her sheathed scimitar bouncing against her thigh. She looked like every other Verena in the palace, except that she actually liked to hang with the rabble outside.
You caught us. We were just gonna go on a banana bread break. You know I don't eat that garbage,
she said, her eyes dancing as she pulled a sliver of wild berry tart, wrapped in parchment, from her pocket.
I only indulge in the finest monarch leftovers.
She joined them every few days in the afternoon, in between her shifts, watching over the kitchen during the day, and the late-night East Passage rounds. Being so close to the servants humming in and out of the kitchen meant she always had the best gossip and treats to share, and she knew she'd find a grateful audience in the outcast boys below.
So,
Cleet said, deviously steepling his fingers together.
What's new in your aristocratic sanctuary? Oh, you want my news?
She teased, plucking the plumpest berry from her snack's crust.
You want to know what's sending everyone in that kitchen to absolutely lose their minds today? Please tell me it's traitors.
Cleet willed.
One bonfire of warning just isn't enough for this rough town.
She rolled her eyes, shifting her weight to her other hip.
The Queen emerged from her childhood bedroom yesterday. No one's seen her since Link's rotting bones got dumped in her book depository.
Link's eyes grew wide, and he held his breath, just in case she grew quiet in the details.
One of the house cleaners, some little Rito, got scared half to death when she threw open the door and said she wanted to go down to dinner, and this sparrow comes squawking down into the guardhouse, ranting like she's seen a ghost. So they bring in all her stuff, because she smells about as good as her hero did at that point. They get her all ready to see the king, who's just been eating alone down there every night, not even able to celebrate the fact that he's locked down Hyrule because he's wondering if she'll ever come out of the West Wing. And if she does come out, you know, how is she going to take it? What? You mean not appreciating the swift apprehension of her captor?
Herman said with a laugh.
Okay, come on. We all know she's not an idiot, even if most of her subjects swallowed that story up with a spoon.
She pointed out.
But none of us knew if she was going to come out and abide by her oath of fealty or not. Who knows? Maybe she was going to grab some butter knives and go down in a blaze of glory. Or she could have cracked, lost her goddamn mind under the pressure, and we'd have to eventually break down the door and neutralize the zombie. I thought they seemed to be getting along,
said Herman.
Like, before we brought Link, weren't things pretty good? It's tough to say.
Marina shrugged.
It kinda seemed like it.
Cleet's inverted Sheikah mask bobbed as he nodded in agreement, and in the beat of silence Link begged Marina's loose lips to spill open, as easily as they did about dismissed maids and ruined cakes, to fill in the gaping narrative space of his absence. Some semblance as to what, exactly, Zelda had endured, how she had survived dancing on the scant edge of oblivion for 6 whole months. He had so little to go on from that brush with her life, just those flashes of obsidian silk, the determination in her gait, the blue eyes still kindling a soul. Nothing, old news to this crew.
So, then, what did she do?
Cleet asked.
She went down to dinner. Like the sweet, demure little treasure he's trained her to be.
She let the revelation linger before adding,
But that's not all, not from what I heard.
The three men leaned forward like hens.
Jacina was serving them dessert, and the king was telling the queen, "Oh, I can meet you at breakfast tomorrow. You know, go on back up to your crappy little bedroom on the other side of the castle, and I'll see you in the morning." But she full on tells him, "Oh, no Ganondorf, it's so cold over in the west wing, and I'm so lonely. Maybe I could go right on upstairs with you tonight, as long as it's okay with you." "Oh shit,"
Cleet cackled, shoving Link's shoulder with a jovial whoop.
"Quick, what do we need to ask for? Who needs new boots? Dad's gonna be in a good mood tonight."
Link didn't hear Marina describe Zelda's new kimono, and how knockoffs were going to be hitting that shady market on Front Street, or how much amazing roasted pork was left once the servants emptied the dining spread into the kitchen, and how they could all get a plate if they asked nicely, or muse about why a construction crew was headed into the castle grounds within the next few days. The ringing in his ears seemed to clatter the sky. Weapon, hip hip hip, oi! The untold hours at the Royal Knight Academy. The whole of his youth wiping emotion from any physical manifestation, pouring it into a tactical posture. Strangle the hilt, legs a hip apart, breathing straight into the core. The boys would spend mornings, afternoons and nights doing nothing but practicing this posture, as the sergeants invented more and more creative ways to distract and torment them. A single, shrill flute note, screaming through the clearing for hours. Small, wounded animals let loose at their feet, begging to die. Impossibly personal insults hurled for all to hear, twisting thumbs into weaknesses they'd yet to discover they even had. He learned not to blink. So quickly, faster than his brothers, the ones who broke, who cried, who were sent packing to their villages and towns to find new vocations. Fast enough to be escorted before any of them to the Lost Woods, for the trial of the hero, heaving it so easily from its pedestal as to seem nothing but inevitable. And yet, this. They couldn't mean, they couldn't know, that Zelda was acting out of anything but obligation. The notion that she could transcend preservation, to divine pleasure from the Demon King. It was beyond his imagination, a reality he physically could not manifest in his mind's eye without his guts lurching, the ground slanting to the sky, threatening to send him slipping under. Clawing, swinging, screaming his way through this consortium of gleeful clowns, feasting on the surreal scraps of grotesque novelty that they plucked and packaged and traded between each other, as real to them as characters in a play. The same breathlessness that had, for all those years, been so worried about where they were spotted, and when he'd propose and how they could claim a fragment of happily ever after, turned as quickly as an ocean gale. He could hack his way up the sparse halls, to that chamber, to slice off every finger that had touched her, just as slowly and painfully as these 6 abominable months had been. The longer he's lulled off the defense, the easier he'll fall, not being derailed by anything, or anyone we might see. Piero's warning bubbled up like magma in the dizzying cacophony, snagging his nerves in their grip fire against fury. She'd begged him to remember the trap set at his one weakness threshold, the price of admission for seeing her alive. These goons couldn't know or understand Zelda's strategy. It wasn't digestible. It didn't make for easy conversation over smuggled pie. No, they couldn't glimpse the game grinding beneath, the reason she could ever be confused for accepting of such a fate. She's throwing the scent. Yes, this was great news, certainly. This could only mean that she did in fact believe that he was still alive, and understood his chance to return. In those meditative weeks, sequestered away in shock, she'd pieced together Pura and Pai-A's edict for herself, that they all needed to find the precise moment to knock the king back into oblivion. That's what this assumed tenderness was. Her own spell shot back, as dulling as the supposed chasm swallowing her up, training Ganondorf's eye up to the beauty, the shimmer, the luxury of her affection. Nothing, certainly, but mirrors.
Gimbo,
Cleet hollered to Link, the name he'd stolen with the uniform.
Are you gonna get in on this pork hookup or what? Sure.
He slurred, marveling at how convincing he'd become as human amongst them. End of chapter.